Hey everyone, today we're starting Unit 4, Notes number 1. So these are our first set of notes for second semester. So we're going to start immediately following World War One and kind of the problems that it creates for the US. So these notes are titled Post-War Havoc. So, post war trends. World War One had left much of the American public exhausted. So, people were tired from the fighting. Soldiers are returning home, oftentimes having difficulty finding jobs. Americans responded to the stressful conditions by becoming fearful of outsiders, specifically immigrants. A wave of nativism or prejudice against foreign born people began to sweep through the nation. And we've talked about nativism before. So remember, it's native born Americans, not Native Americans, but people that have been born in the US that feel that they are the true Americans. And they don't like immigrants and newcomers, foreigners coming into our country. A belief in isolationism also began to kind of gain popularity. Isolationism is a policy of pulling away from the involvement in world affairs. So, because we were so involved in World War One and then involved so many other countries, resulted in soldiers dying, other factors within the economy. Now, most Americans kind of wanted to keep to themselves. We didn't really want to be involved in worldly affairs as a direct result of World War One. This also contributed to a fear of communism. So while all this is happening in Russia, they're having a Russian revolution where Vladimir Lenin, communism takes over. It is a very bloody revolution. The royal family of Russia is killed, and the Communist Party, the Bolsheviks, take over. And so when Americans hear about this and they associate that bloody overthrow with communism, of course, people are going to see communism as a threat and be fearful of it. So, one perceived threat to American life was the spread of communism. So, it's an economic and political system based on a single party government ruled by a dictatorship. So, communism would put an end to private property and move towards government ownership of business, which is a direct conflict with democracy, with capitalism. And so these ideals don't necessarily mesh with what America stands for. So, a panic known as the Red Scare began as a result of this fear, the fact that communist literature and a communist party began to take root in America. People were fearful that the extreme forms of communism could possibly happen in America. The Palmer raids. So, communists or so called Reds um, were out for a worldwide revolution that would abolish capitalism everywhere. So, they didn't like the fact that there was very, very wealthy and then very, very rich. They thought everyone should be equal. U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer took action to combat this Red Scare. There had been mail bombs to government offices, and so he wanted to catch these suspected radicals and put an end to it. Palmer and his agents hunted down suspected communists, socialists, and anarchists. Anarchists were people who opposed any form of government, essentially just radical thinkers. They were often jailed without legal counsel. If immigrants were found as part of these Palmer raids, many of them were deported without any type of a trial. So, with these Palmer raids, no actual threats were found, no substantiated threats, and eventually they just died down. So, Sacco and Vanzetti. With Sacco and Vanzetti, they are two Italian immigrants. So it's Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. And they were arrested in 1920 and they were charged with robbery and murder. So they were both Italian immigrants and known anarchists. So people knew their kind of extreme radical political beliefs. And so when they were arrested and put on trial, the trial focused more on who they were, what their beliefs are, and not so much about the evidence of the crime. They became victims of the country's Red Scare paranoia or fear of communism, these nativist feelings that had kind of taken over the country at the time. So they were found guilty and sentenced to death despite asserting their innocence. They had provided alibis for the time of the crime, and only circumstantial evidence had existed. But despite that, they were eventually executed in 1927, which led to a huge uproar, not only across the country, but worldwide. Many people felt that they were not treated fairly and not given a proper trial. So now let's stop and think. How does the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti illustrate the country's nativist feelings? And so, this post war America, you have the fear of communism, you have nativist feelings, you have the country wanting to be more isolationist and keep away from foreigners, keep out foreigners. Um, and so what we began to see is this kind of hysteria and paranoia take over, and become very, very fearful of the unknown, of foreign ideas, and the fact that they threatened American ideals like democracy and capitalism. And so they were put on trial for um, more for those beliefs than actual evidence for the actual crime. People were more focused on who they were, not the um, evidence within the crime. Limiting immigration. During the wave of nativist sentiment, keep America for Americans became the prevailing attitude. Nativist feelings were fueled by the fact that some of the people involved in post war labor disputes were immigrant anarchists and socialists. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 set up a quota system that established the maximum number of immigrants who could enter the U.S. from each foreign country. So the goal was to sharply cut European immigration to the US. But the way that it was set up, it was to target um, immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe specifically. So Russia, Greece, Italy, these were considered less desirable immigrants. And also you think about the Russian Revolution and communism, it felt that the more radical ideas were coming from this part of Europe. And so they tried to limit that immigration. So let's see. So we look at this chart and it shows you the different diagrams from 1921 to 1929 of immigrants coming from different countries. So if you look at Italy specifically, in 1921, you had probably about 220,000 immigrants. Then in 1929, you had probably maybe like 15,000. So you can just see the areas where there's sharp differences of where they were trying to limit, where some of them just kind of stayed the same. But then you can also see this blue one is Poland. You have Yugoslavia, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. So Eastern Europe, of areas that they did not necessarily want immigrants coming from that part of Europe. And so we see immigrants get blamed for these radical ideas, that the reason these ideas are coming to America are because of immigrants, not just that ideas get shared and ideas get moved around. The Prohibition Experiment. In January 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect. This launched a new era of prohibition during which the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages were legally prohibited. So that means that alcohol could not be made, it could not be sold, and it could not be transported. So reformers had long considered liquor as a prime cause of corruption. People believed that it led to men becoming drunk, beating their wives, beating their families, lower productivity at the workplace because they would be hungover and then go to work, led to higher crime. So the idea is that if alcohol is prohibited, if it's taken out of the equation, then none of these other social ills will exist. So support for prohibition came largely from the rural South and West, basically from native born Protestants. The church affiliated Anti Saloon League and Women's Christian Temperance Union also helped to push the measure through the government. Most immigrant groups did not consider drinking a sin, but a natural part of socializing. So, again, you see kind of the native born Protestants asserting what they believe to be a problem, where you have immigrant groups like Germans and Italians that, drink socially and don't really see it wrong. So, you begin to see this kind of conflict from native born Americans versus kind of immigrant beliefs. Speakeasies and bootleggers. To obtain liquor illegally, drinkers went underground to hidden saloons and nightclubs known as speakeasies. They could be found everywhere. To get into a speakeasy, one would have to present a card or a password. And so, what we see here is that we have this amendment, we have this law that's all across the country, it's a federal law, but people are just not following it. And the level to which they're not following it is prolific. It's happening everywhere. So people also began to learn how to distill their own alcohol and built their own stills. People bought liquor from bootleggers, named for a smuggling practice of carrying liquor in the legs of boots. Could be smuggled in from Canada, Cuba, the West Indies, because liquor could still be made elsewhere and then it'd be brought into the US to be sold in these speakeasies, underground clubs, for a very, very high profit. So, organized crime. Prohibition not only generated disrespect for the law, it also contributed to organized crime in nearly every major city. So, where the goal of prohibition was to decrease crime, it actually created a black market for alcohol that allowed for organized crime to make a lot of money. So, we saw more of an increase in crime as a result. Chicago became notorious as the home of Al Capone, a gangster whose bootlegging empire netted over $60 million a year. So Al Capone it was difficult for the FBI to catch him. They eventually did catch him, but on tax evasion for not paying his taxes correctly, not for bootlegging or all the other crimes that he committed. By the mid 1920s, only 19% of Americans supported prohibition, so it was losing its support. The rest believed that prohibition caused worse effects than the initial problem. So, some causes and effects of prohibition. So, causes why prohibition went into effect. Lots of religious groups and reformers felt that it was a huge problem. It led to many ills of society, crime, child and wife abuse, accidents at the home. And so the effects of having prohibition is that you saw um, disrespect for the law. Um, there was an increase in smuggling, organized crime grew. So it didn't necessarily have the effects it was intended to have. So prohibition remained in force until 1933, when the 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st Amendment. That was the only time an amendment has been repealed. So let's stop and think. Why was prohibition not successful? And so the biggest reason is that it really didn't have support from the public. People were not willing to follow the law. And we can kind of see that today with kind of mask enforcement and um, restaurants being closed. I mean, in California, they're not supposed to serve, but I could drive around and see that some places are still serving people. So it really, for laws to be effective, the public really has to abide by them. And so it was also very difficult to enforce by um, the authorities because if you think of alcohol being smuggled into our country, the amount of coastline and borders that we have, you can't patrol everywhere. So if people aren't going to follow the law, if it's difficult to enforce, it just isn't going to be successful. So science and religion clash. Fundamentalists were skeptical of some scientific discoveries and theories. They believed that important knowledge could be found in the Bible. Sorry, that all important knowledge could be found in the Bible. Their beliefs led them to reject the theory of evolution advanced by Charles Darwin, stating that plant and animal species had developed and changed over millions of years. Instead, they believed in creation. So, but they basically saw the Bible as if it says it in the Bible, that's how it happened. There's no interpretation. You can't question it. So, the claim that they had found most unbelievable with evolution was the idea that humans had evolved from apes. In March of 1925, Tennessee passed the nation's first law that made it a crime to teach evolution. John Scopes, a young biology teacher in Tennessee, decided to challenge the law. So he taught the theory of evolution, and he was arrested for violating the law, and he was defended by the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. The Scopes trial. So the ACLU hired Clarence Darrow, the most famous trial lawyer, to defend Scopes. William Jennings Bryan, a devout fundamentalist, served as a special prosecutor. So Clarence Darrow on Scopes' side that evolution should be allowed. William Jennings Bryan felt that it should not. So the Scopes trial was fought over evolution and the role of science and religion in public schools and in American society. So it represented a lot more than just evolution. In the end, Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. The Tennessee Supreme Court would later change the verdict on a technicality, but the law would remain in place for decades. And so, what we really see here is this very specific trial, but it really represents that change that's happening in the 1920s, kind of old versus new. And do people want to change? Are they accepting of change? So now let's stop and think. What conflicts do we see emerging in the 1920s? So with the Scopes trial, we're seeing kind of traditionalist thinking, and then maybe versus the more modern scientific thinking, and how sometimes they don't always go hand in hand. We see conflicts with people following the law, as with in prohibition. We see conflicts with foreigners, with new ideas such as communism, and how we're going to adjust for those ideas um, within our country, how we can balance new and changing ideas um, within all of the citizens of the U.S. So we're done with the notes.